Hey guys, welcome to the Neglected Podcast. This podcast is not to change your mind, but to invite you into somebody else's narrative. This is a podcast to give a voice to the neglected. It is also an opportunity for all of us to engage.
Hi, Neglected Podcast listeners. This is your host, Jovanna, and I am here today in the studio with Miss Erin. Say hello.
Hello.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with her. And as we get to talking, we'll probably talk about how I got to know her story. So, Miss Erin, in as many words as you feel comfortable, introduce yourself to our listeners.
All right. Well, as she said, my name is Erin. I am originally from Texas and met my husband there, born and raised there. And so met him in college, and he is what brought us to Savannah. And he got into PA school here. So we spent the first 3 or 4 years of our marriage, with him in school, which was fun. But, once he got out, we got to do a lot of fun stuff. Being far away from family was hard, but we liked having access to the East Coast and everything like that. Yeah. So we're from Texas. He's part of a 3-person family. I have both my parents and my brother. And so, we're far away from family here. So we kind of got plugged in here and just really have enjoyed being in this area. And whatnot. So I worked for a church for a while doing graphic design, and I now stay home with my 1+-year-old son, who we got through kind of special means. So we enjoy him, but even more so because we struggle a little bit to have him. So that's kind of baseline story about me. Not super interesting, but
well, thanks for that. I mean. So I've met you at church, but how I got to know a little bit about your story was you posted about infertility, and I just asked you prior to recording if it was for a national awareness, and you had mentioned yes, it was for national infertility awareness. And I was just struck by your vulnerability and how much you were sharing, and I really appreciated that because right now I'm not married and I don't have kids, but I plan to. But I do have some friends that are in the process of trying to get pregnant, and some have gotten some news that they're going to have to do a little bit more, and some it's just timing. So your story really just was so open. And so I had asked you if you would come in and talk about that. So you mentioned that you and your husband had been married for a while, and was it one of those things where you're like, okay, you're not in school anymore, and now we would like to do some family planning?
It was kind of both. When we got married, we were 23, so we were pretty young, and in my head, I had a conversation with my friend in college, and I was like, I'm going to wait 5 years. I want to have that marriage with him. I want to build that foundation with him before you have kids, just because they are such a, once you have them, you don't ever not have them. And,
Good point.
Right. They don't just disappear. And so, I wanted us to, I love my husband. So I wanted to enjoy that time with just him. And so, especially because he was going to be in school, we wanted to be able to travel and do things that is also harder when you have kids. And so, he was in school, and then once he was out of school, we traveled a little bit, took a couple trips. And then it got to the point to where, if I'm being honest, I was ready. He was a little bit less so, but he kind of, I guess, let me take the lead on that, because I think we both had a hard time I don't think you're ever fully ready for that. Especially when you think about it, all the things you're going to have to give up when you don't know this little person you're giving it up for. And so that was a little hard for both of us to reconcile. But then I just all of a sudden was ready. And so we, that was about 4.5 years into our marriage. So it was about in my perfect timeline of what I thought I wanted. And so we started kind of trying to start our family then. And funny enough, I'm an anxious person. And so I had a lot of anxiety about it anyways. I was like, what if something's wrong? Like, what if this or that? And my husband, who's a medical person, was just like, we're fine. Like, we'll be perfectly fine. And so, we had spent about 8 or 9 months trying and not having success. And so we finally started to, go to the doctor and try and figure out, okay, is there something wrong? I mean, they tell you to typically take about a year of trying. It can take that long for people who are completely healthy, fertility wise. And so they, saw us a little bit earlier, probably due to my anxiety, and started to run some tests and whatnot. And I remember the exact date. I remember where I was when we got the test results, and remember texting my husband because he was at work. He works in an ER, and he can't talk on the phone, but he had gotten the test results, and we're talking about him. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he was like, it means we may not be able to have kids. And I just remember sitting at our counter in our kitchen by myself. It was a weekend or something like that. And again, being far from family was super hard during this kind of stuff because I'm just sitting there by myself and can't talk to anybody about it. Knowing that, this person that I love and want to start a family with, like, we may not be able to in the more normal means. And, just crying and whatnot. So we were immediately referred to a reproductive endocrinologist, and a really long way to say a fertility doctor. And we were told it can take a long time it took us 3 months to get in to see him. And when you've already been trying for a while, like, that's really daunting for people. And that was honestly a pretty quick turnaround. We had been told it can take 6 months to a year to just get in to see a doctor. And so we got to see him, and he had a couple different strategies, but there's a lot of what we didn't realize is there's a lot of different levels of fertility treatments depending on, what the issue is. And so one of the things he wanted to try first was what's called IUI. I think it's basically artificial insemination. And so they would have me be on some type of medicine that would help me ovulate at a certain time, and then they would insert the sperm up into the uterus and all this fun stuff that nobody likes to talk about because it's awkward. But so we tried that twice, knowing that it would likely not work, but it's a lot less expensive. It's typically under $1,000 versus IVF, which averages $12,000 to $15,000.
Wow.
So we decided to try that route first, just to hope and see if that would work. And it didn't. So then we were on kind of the agonizing wait of waiting for IVF, which was another 3 months after our failed IUIs. And so I don't know if you want me to go into that process. So with IVF, it's interesting. And people always found it a little bit amusing because they'd be like, okay, so like, what's the first step? And it's like, they put you on birth control, which is really counterintuitive when you're wanting to get pregnant. But they put you on birth control so that they can control your cycle. They typically try, and at least our office did, they tried to do kind of a batch of cycles. So they would time everyone to where they were all at a similar place, and that way he's doing similar things. Because there's part of it that's considered surgery, and so then he's not having to do that on top of handling kind of the mediating of people's cycles. And so so they start you on birth control, which honestly was one of the worst parts because I get really hormonal headaches, and I wasn't on birth control due to the headaches, and so it makes you super crazy, or it made me super crazy. And so I was on that for about a month and a half before, and then they start you on some shots to suppress your cycle and your system. And so we started those, and you go in every 2 or 3 days, and they check your blood work, and they check all your anatomy. They check and see, okay, are your eggs developing? Are they, or how many of them are there? Is your lining good? Like all of these things that it's crazy to me how much of that is just naturally happens for most people, and how much of this they micromanage in order to make sure that they can try and get you pregnant. And so they start with that, and then they start what's called stimulations, where they it's different types of stimulating drugs that stimulate your ovaries to produce bigger and more of them. And we had started that, and we were about 2 days in when we found out that we were going to have to evacuate for a hurricane. Oh, no. And I remember being nervous about it, but my doctor kind of assured me, like, we should be okay. They didn't evacuate us for Matthew, and then I got the call the next morning that they were evacuating. And so that's really important when it comes to IVF, because they monitor you so closely. They monitor your levels. If they overstimulate you, they can basically lose those eggs. Those eggs are what they call blown out, and it just means that there's too much, and that they've lost that. And so my doctor gave us kind of 2 options. We can either basically abandon this cycle, and he would get us in sometime before the end of the year, or we could keep going, but he would have to kind of guess on what he was going to do with my medicine. And it sounds crazy when I think about it now, but we decided to go with that option to kind of let him project what he thinks my body might do, since he hadn't seen it do IVF before. And so he actually ended up understimulating me a little bit, and we kind of realized that the further on, it was hard to get my follicles and eggs and everything to the point that he wanted to set them to ovulate. Again, all these things that your body just does naturally that you don't realize that they have to manipulate. And so we ended up continuing on that cycle. And then when he does what they call as an egg retrieval, and it's a surgical procedure where they put you under, and they basically go in and take the eggs out, and very quick procedure. And then you wake up and you find out how many eggs they got. And for me, they had gotten 9, but 3 of them they didn't think were probably viable eggs. And so we think we had about 6. And then after that, they can do one of 2 ways. They can either let them fertilize naturally, or they can fertilize it for you, which is an additional cost, which is what we ended up doing. Because he recommended, he was like, well, if you're already spending all this money to do it, you might as well make sure that they fertilize. And so we ended up doing that, and we had 3 embryos that came out of it. And so he lets them, they have like a 5-day life where they kind of like monitor them and see, okay, do they form to the point that we want them to? Do they divide enough times? Do they do all this crazy stuff that, again, you just never think about? And 2 of them made it, and 1 of them didn't. And so they went ahead and did what they call a transfer of 2 of them into my uterus. And so they transferred those 2. And then you basically have about a week and a half of waiting, which is really, really rough, because you may or may not be pregnant. You're on progesterone shots, which are about the worst shot. They're super thick. They're in sesame oil. So you think about a super thick needle and doing that. There was the very last night that I had to do one. I had to do it into my thigh. So you think of an intermuscular shot into your thigh. It was the least fun, but those make you really tired. They make you feel pregnant, even though you don't know if you are yet. And so you do those for about a week and a half. Some women have to do those entire first trimester. I give it up to you ladies, because that it was rough for the 2 weeks I had to do that.
Yeah.
But we found out a week and a half later, it was very faint, but we found out that we had been successful with it, which was, my doctor was actually really surprised because of how hard of a time he had getting my eggs out, and a number of different things. But I think he was even a little bit surprised that it was a success. So it's such an intricate process, and it's such a, I don't know, it's something that is so taboo to talk about when it comes to infertility, and it's so emotional to go through, that, I mean, it is something that I feel like so many people go through completely unbeknownst to anybody around them. And that's just really, really hard. We had told very few people that we were going through it at the time, and I regret that a little bit now. But at the time, I didn't know that I could handle other people watching you go through something that vulnerable and that intense.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how we actually got my little 1-year-old that I stay home with now. So we had him through IVF, and that makes it, I know everybody loves their kid, but I think it made us really appreciate how we had to get him, and appreciate having him a little bit more than if it had just come, the easy way.
Yeah. No,
at least for us. So, yeah.
And what I like that you touched on towards the end was just the emotional toll. And so take me back to getting the news that, you were mentioning that you were a little bit anxious. So you went in at the 9-month mark, and so you get the news that something actually is wrong.
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
It was rough. It was really rough. And I mean, that's kind of an understatement, but I think that you grow up, people who want to be parents, people who dream of only being parents. Like, I mean, I didn't ever think like, I just want to be a mom, but I know there's so many women that's what they want to be when they grow up. And, my husband, like, I always knew he would be such a great dad. And so, we just thought once we wanted a family, like, we would just start a family. And so when you start that process and you realize, like, okay, something might be wrong, it makes you kind of evaluate, okay, like, what if there is a problem? Like, what if we can't have our own kids? And, so getting that news and getting that confirmation, it's like, it's so jarring to this reality of, oh, well, when I want something, I just have to work for it, or I just have to do this or that. Like, we could try as hard as we want, but if this isn't what God has in our future, like, there's not anything we can do to change that. And that was really hard. I think both of us coming from, I feel like, a pretty privileged upbringing, where it's like, I feel like if you just worked hard enough, like, things kind of worked for you. And so not seeing this be that same way, I feel like it's kind of God really calling us to evaluate that mindset, because it's not biblical. Like, that's not, everything in the Bible isn't easy, or, he gives people trials. And so that really called to question our faith and kind of what we believed. And, it made it really hard when it came to the people around you who either didn't know you were going through it, or didn't really know how to interact with you or how to help you. It was really trying. It was a really trying time for both my husband and I, especially being far away from family and not really having, at that point, I didn't really feel like I had a solid foundation outside of my husband. So I didn't really know where to turn. I didn't really know what to do. And, it's very isolating. It was really, really isolating. And I don't know. It was definitely one of the harder points in our marriage, because I don't think either of us knew quite how to help each other, because we would both go through different things. Yeah. And that made it hard to really, I mean, we leaned on each other, but I don't think we quite knew how to help each other either. And again, it's such a taboo topic of trying to get pregnant. Like, I remember telling my dad, and he didn't even really want to touch on the subject because I think it made him uncomfortable to talk about that we had been trying to have a family, because that's his daughter, and that's awkward, and I get that, but it made it feel even more isolated that nobody would really, I didn't feel comfortable bringing it up to people, and nobody would really talk about that anybody would talk about that they were going through that unless they were already through it.
Gotcha, yeah.
And that's hard because you sometimes need people who are in the trenches with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
what do you think that's about? Like, as a woman, or even as a man, when you're ready to build your family and you get the news that it's not going to be the quote unquote normal way. It's probably not going to look like we just got pregnant. Mm-hmm. What do you think that is about, like, not wanting to necessarily share? Like, where do you see the taboo?
I mean, I think it can come from a couple different places. I think people don't like to talk about sex. Yeah. I mean, they don't like to talk about, I don't know, like, you just see people end up pregnant and it's like, well, you know how that happens. Yeah. But,
they just held hands.
Right. They just held hands and they have a baby. So, I mean, you know how it happens, but it's not ever openly discussed. It's not like, oh, well, I know what they did. And so I think it's somewhat related to that. I think some of it is just the guilt and the feelings of there's something that's like the guilt of the person who is maybe causing the infertility or, I know that was hard for us. And I think part of it is just that we live these social media lives where we want everything to appear perfect and, like everything's just as it's supposed to be. And so when you come up against obstacles that may not look how you thought they were going to, it's hard to want to share that with people because it goes against that need to feel perfect. I know for us, the reason that we weren't as open about it was because I just didn't feel like I could be that vulnerable with people. Yeah. I mean, my mom knew that we were going through it. And I think my dad might have known, but they didn't know the exact timeline because I didn't want to be responsible for them feeling disappointed if it doesn't work. Yeah. And so I know for us, I didn't want to be open about that for that reason, and because you get a lot of judgment. You get judgmental thoughts that are meant to be helpful.
Yeah. What do you mean?
So, like, a lot of I love them, but a lot of church people would talk to you about, well, I mean, if it's meant to be, it'll happen. It's like that kind of stuff where it's like, God will bless you, or I even hear it now where it's like, God rewards you with children. And it's like, so what if he doesn't reward you with children? Does that mean he's punishing you? Like, I just feel like the way people talk about it can be really hurtful. And it opened myself up in a lot of situations to hurtful comments that weren't meant to be hurtful. People who, would tell me they were pregnant and then they would try and adapt it to make me feel better, but it's like then it just sounds patronizing, or like it just made it really uncomfortable when people did know what we were going through. And like I said, I think it was just a lot of comments. I actually sought out a counselor before we were doing IVF, and I remember I love counselors and I've gone to some great ones, and this was not one of them, because she's just telling me like, well, make sure that you have some friends and make sure that you're outside a lot. And, you should probably get your husband to prescribe you some stuff for depression, which, super not ethical. And, she told me about her daughter who, that her and her husband had gone through this, and, they started to adopt and then they got pregnant. So I guess you just need to adopt. And it's like, if it were just that easy, like people they've heard these stories of, well, this happened and then this happened. And they think that it just sums up like, you just need to relax, or you just need to, if you just stopped trying, quote unquote, then it would probably just happen. And it just made it really hard because it's like, you don't even know the half of it, but they have no way of knowing. And even having gone through it now, like, I don't feel like I fully can understand what that's like in the moment, because I'm on the other side, and it's like, well, now it's okay. But I remember being in that moment and feeling just so isolated, because it's like, I don't feel like anybody gets how hard this is, how raw this is right now. So comments like that made it a little bit harder.
No, and I think I always err on giving people more credit than they probably do. But I think so much of that comes from an uncomfortable place. Because if I sit with you in your pain and I just acknowledge that you hurt, and I don't have the answers, but I'm just going to sit with you as you hurt, then I'm uncomfortable too.
Right.
I think that there is some comfort in just saying, in a twisted way that doesn't make it right, but I think there is some comfort in just saying, like, well, here is your prescription. Just like, stop trying. Right. Or God's just going to give it to you, or adopt 3 kids and then God will give you. And I think that there is that thing in us that's just like, man, if I just sit with you in your pain, then that means that both of us are sad.
Right.
But I think what I'm hearing from you, and what I can even say from hard times in my life, is sometimes that's what you want, is just to be seen in that, and just someone to say, I'm sorry that you hurt.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that either one of us can do about it, but I'm willing to sit with you in it.
Right.
And I know that's hard. That's not an easy ask. But the other stuff, that almost wounds you more.
Yeah, it kind of rubs salt in it a little bit, especially when it's like the Christianese answer of, well, if it's meant to be, it'll happen. It's like, so you're telling me that God wants me to be in pain. And I'm not saying that that's not sometimes true. Not that he wants you to, but that he needs you to be. But that doesn't help me in the moment when I'm in pain. And I think you're exactly right. I think a lot of what I needed in that moment was not answers, because it's not, we had tried a lot of different things, but it was just to have somebody be there, to just be in, not somebody to let me cry with them, and to be scared with. It's a scary thing when you're you think about buying a car, you buy anything that's $15,000 worth of something, like, you're walking out with something. And so to put that much money and that much hope into something that is completely you don't have a given on that. It's terrifying. And it's terrifying to know that if it doesn't work, I don't know what the next step is. Because we didn't know it. We couldn't think past that. And so, to just have people there to kind of sit with you in those moments, and to just be there. Like you said, I know it's uncomfortable, and I wouldn't have known what to say to someone had I not gone through it. And even now, I feel like I'm not always the best, because you want to try and fix it for them, or to make them feel better, because that's our human nature is. Yeah. You want to make them not feel sad. And I get that. But like you said, I think sometimes that can actually be add to the hurt in a way that you're not anticipating. Yeah. Just because you're saying things that come naturally, but there's so much about this that there's no right answer for. And in fact, some of the things that you think would help are actually the most hurtful. And it's hard to know that until you've been in that situation. Even the people that I've watched go through that, I find myself wanting to give them the same answers. Even though it's like, oh, it'll be okay. And it's like, but you don't know if it will. And I remembered hating that in the moment. It's like, you don't know that it will be. It's okay for it to not be, but I don't want to feel like you're making it feel better for yourself because you don't know how to help me. So it is hard to sit in that moment with people when they're going through darker times like that, and you don't know if that situation will be better, Yeah.
No, that is a thing that and I didn't come into knowing that. I don't want anybody to ever think that oh, I just knew to do that. I might have mentioned this before, but when I was going through counselor training, we had a professor that said, when you feel that urge to give advice, when you're hearing that hard thing and you feel that urge to give advice, ask yourself, is this for them or is this for me? Because you said oftentimes you're giving advice to alleviate the stress you're feeling, because it is stressful to sit in other people's pain, but not, and this isn't to be crass, but like I get to leave. And so the least I could do is sit with you in it, you know, because if you're not the one dealing with infertility, if you're not the one dealing with the grief, because that would sound to me like you're not just dealing with the fact that we're going to have to do things different, but you're also dealing with the death of a dream, because that's not uncommon to get married and think, well, in 5-10 years, we'll just have kids, or we'll have kids right away, or whatever your plan was. You're dealing with the death of that plan. Now you're dealing with having a new plan that is super uncertain, probably feeling some kind of brokenness. The culture doesn't help, because I'll be honest, the stuff I know about our bodies now, I didn't grow up knowing. Like, I would have been under the impression that you just get pregnant, like, because that was the thing, like, just don't get pregnant. I'm like, so like I just stumble into somebody and then I'm pregnant? Like, how does this work?
So easy.
But then like you're dealing with all of that. But I think that just for me, I have to remind myself that, like, yes, might be uncomfortable sitting with this friend as they are grieving, or they're sad that they have to go to the doctor so much, or they're sad that they're hurting. I get to leave. And so the least I can do is sit with you in this.
Right.
You know, but because if I change my thought process too, like, I'm probably giving you advice because I'm this uncomfortable with sitting you for it. Like, I can't imagine how uncomfortable you are. So that is my hope, that we would talk more about this kind of thing, because I mean, I know for me now, being in my mid 30s, I'm hearing about it more. I'm hearing about people who aren't just able to get pregnant, who are doing the IVF or the shots, and they're having to, and I don't know where that's coming from. I don't know. I know that I'm hearing a lot of it has to do with age. That's a big factor. But what led you to making that decision on National Infertility Awareness Month to share your story? What led you there?
I think because for me, I know that a lot of my encouragement was from seeing, I said earlier, like, I wish that I'd had somebody who was going through it at the same time, because, like, there's something about being in the trenches. But what gave me hope was seeing other people that had gone through it and had success. And I also just felt like maybe by talking about it, it could open up that line of communication a little bit more, so that the comments that were so hurtful to me and my husband wouldn't necessarily be duplicated, or make people think a little bit more about what they're saying, rather than, you know, just blurting out whatever comes to mind because they are uncomfortable. You know, because I had a few people ask me, like, how do I be there for my friend who's going through infertility? And I think people really want to know how, but it is such a hard season of knowing how to be there for somebody when you can't understand that. And so I thought that by being open about our journey, it could open up that dialogue about, you know, this is what we went through, and make people think. And especially I had a couple of people tell me, like, I had no idea how intensive it was. And just kind of making people aware, like, okay, like, IVF's become a very commonplace type of thing to talk about. Like, people kind of mention it, but they don't really understand the lengths of what you have to go through. I mean, there's literally a surgical procedure, and there's, I mean, probably 75 plus shots. And this is coming from somebody who had to be held down until they were like 12. Shots were not my thing. They still aren't, but I mean, obviously you get a little bit more used to it. So, I mean, I wanted people to be aware of how much of a process that was, because I think it gets a little bit thrown out there now because it is a little bit more common to talk about, and I'm glad, but it doesn't mean that it feels common in the moment to go through it. And again, I just wanted that dialogue of, I was hurt by some of the ways that people handled it, and I wanted to maybe help people to think through that a little bit and to understand why it was hurtful, just by seeing what that process looked like. Because it is a difficult season to go through. And I think that people don't always think, like, oh, if they're going through IVF, like like you said, it's kind of after the death of a dream, the death of something that you feel like is guaranteed in your life.
Yeah.
And there's something about that is taken away that really messes with you a little bit, and can really wreck you a little bit, that this thing that I thought was for certain is no longer certain. And then you're going through a medical process to try and do it, and it's expensive. Like, that's a really hard season. And I don't think that people always see that, because they see either a success or they see, that they just went to adoption. I have so many friends who have gone through adoptions, and it's like, but they either went through IVF or they went through a long season of trying as well. And I just think that it gets glossed over a little bit. The process of getting to the point that you realize having a family may not be an instant thing like you thought it would. So I just wanted to be open about that and kind of let people in on that part of our life, so that they could see kind of the struggles we had, and maybe make them a little bit more aware of how they can help their friends who might be going through that.
Yeah. What was the response after you posted it? What was the response like?
It was incredible. It really was. I had people who came through and said, I had no idea. I had people who had been close to me that said, I'm really sorry. Like, I didn't realize how intricate of a process that was. Like, I didn't realize how much you were actually going through in that moment, which meant a lot to me. And then I had a lot of people who, are going through it currently, were going through it then. So this was back, I think, in April or May. And so, a lot of people. It's still a little surprising to me how many people I know that have gone through infertility. And then I think about it, statistically, 1 in 8 women and families will, or 1 in 8 couples will. And so it shouldn't surprise me. But yeah, it was overwhelmingly positive. And just, I think that people really, especially the ones going through it, really appreciate hearing stories about other women who have gone through it, just because it either gives them hope or it gives them insight into something they may have to be doing soon. It opened up the line for people to ask questions, either about the process or I think it just made people feel like they knew me a little bit better, because that is, it's on social media. Like, you feel like you kind of know people, but then you get to see a real side to people when they're going through something like that. And so, overwhelmingly was very positive, really, I think made it feel more vulnerable with people that I knew but didn't actually know they were going through that either. So that was really neat.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. I am so glad that you shared your experience, because 1, it led to us having this conversation, but 2, it's just what you said. You don't know what you don't know. And it's hard. I think it's hard for most of us to have empathy without the proximity. Absolutely. Like, if you've never went through it or been with a friend going through it, like, it is, you just don't know how the process is and how long of a process it is. And I think that you touched on that a little bit, of like being able to give people insight of like, this was the journey. It wasn't just like we found out and then we were able to do the procedure. Like, this is a medical procedure. There's lots of shots. There's a lot going on there. And I don't think it's everybody's responsibility to be like really open all the time, but it is. It's that you get we had to do IVF, but here's our baby.
Right.
You don't get the middle bits of like having the procedures done, it not working, then deciding not to adopt, and whatever the story might be. I think because we only see the end, we just assume people are fine. Right. Because again, like, most of us don't walk around just like weeping everywhere in public. So people just assume that they're fine. Like, this couple's fine. And I'm not sure, like, in your marriage, if you ever got in the midst of this, like, when are y'all going to have kids? Like,
yes.
Yeah. So
all the time.
How did that hit when you were trying?
That was some of the harder comments, we found out, and I'm actually really grateful for this, but we found out January 3rd, the year that we were going to probably have to do something like IVF, and we had just gotten home from big family functions and friend functions where we'd gotten that question a lot, and because we'd been married 4.5 years at that point, like people are like, okay, like when are y'all gonna have kids? I mean, people start that as soon as you're married. And so, we've been a little bit down the line, and people are, legitimately asking and teasing us, and it's like, thankfully we didn't have that official diagnosis yet, to say, okay, we just thought, okay, maybe it's taking a little bit. And so, those questions, or, it made you a little snappy in the response once you knew, like, it's like, we're trying.
Yeah.
Like it made you a little frustrated that, and, those are the kind of things, even when we were trying and we'd be around other kids and, somebody would say, are you sure you want one of those? And it's like, yes, I'm pretty sure. Like at this point we've invested, a little bit of money for that. Like, obviously we really want a family, and just questions like that and comments that people are not ill-meaning at all. And we got that, but it stings a lot, because it's like, obviously this is a challenge and it's something that we really want, or we wouldn't be going through this process. And, so having people just make little witty remarks that they don't think twice about, and it's like, those sting a little bit and I think that there's a lot of people who feel that. Got comments a lot at my job where people are pregnant, and it's like, oh, there must be something in the water, and it's like, where's that water?
Can I drink it?
Can I drink the water? Because there's not something in my water. So stuff like that people just don't think about. And like you said, I feel like it's not up to everybody to just be ultra shut down and not talk about anything at all in order to not hurt people's feelings. I think it's just important to try and empathize where people might be coming from in this situation or any situation that you haven't gone through, so that you can minimize the chance that you might say something that would be hurtful. And I mean, they're going to happen either way, but I think as long as you're trying it, that's all that matters. It's like when I knew somebody was trying to be there and trying to help, it didn't mean that it didn't hurt when there was still comments, but I at least trusted their heart. And I think that the more that we're open to kind of trying to think outside of the box of what we know and empathize for people, even if we don't understand how they feel, we're less likely to make those comments. And really, I don't know. So I don't know. I think we got a couple of those, but I feel like if we had started trying right when we got married, we probably would have gotten more. So got a little less, and I guess being further from family got a little bit less. So that helped, I guess. Yeah.
Blessing and curses, yeah.
Right.
No, but I do think that like something I've even been thinking about in my own life is just trying to be humble enough, because I would surely hope, especially people I'm close to, that they would correct me if I'm saying something that's hurtful. If I make a joke thinking I'm being funny, or if I'm saying something thinking I'm being helpful, that they would correct me, that they would say, listen, we're going through some things that I'm not comfortable sharing with you right now, but that stung a little bit. I want to be humble enough to say I'm sorry and not be defensive, because I know that for me, sometimes when I think about correcting people who might have said something that I know they didn't mean to be hurtful, I always overthink though, okay, but what if like that like hits them wrong, and then now we're both hit wrong. Right. But I do think, and that's my hope, is that we would be a people that are moving towards being humble, because we're going to say something that's going to upset somebody, because we don't know what's going on in someone else's life ever. And the little bit that you do get a glimpse into. But then on the other side, I do hope that people who are close to people who are saying something that might be hitting them, that they would feel courageous in saying, like, you don't have to tell them everything, but just that you would say, like, I understand that you're trying to be helpful, but that kind of stings a little bit, Yeah,
absolutely. And I feel like on the other end of things, now that as I've talked to people who know other people who are going through infertility, like there's been a time or two that it's like trying to help them adjust how they're talking about and to these people. Because again, I don't think it's very natural. I think our natural inclination is to make those jokes like, oh, when are you going to have kids and stuff. Like, I think that that's our natural inclination. So people don't think about it. And so there's been a time or two that I've tried to help that. But in the moment of going through it, like another added factor is you're doing all these shots. It's added hormones to your body.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I'm a hot mess anyways, and then you add all these extra hormones and all the extra stuff. I don't feel like I was at all in a great place to emotionally deal with handling those relationships delicately. And so in those moments, like just anybody who knows anybody going through infertility, like give them grace, because there is a lot of just extra hormones, which does add to the complications of that. And so I don't know that I would have felt equipped to handle that well. I know that there's a couple times, and I had to apologize after that I snapped at people that it was just completely outside of my character. And so I think it's something that I agree with you. I think that I would hope that people will be humble enough to accept, and that I hope that people are in a good enough place to be able to voice, because I don't think that there's anything wrong with saying, look, like that really hurt. But I think that it's hard to say that to people when they don't necessarily understand why, when they haven't been in that situation. And so I would hope on both sides that there would be some understanding that, and I think I had to come to that point, that people who haven't gone through this aren't going to understand it the same way that I am, and they're not going to be able to be as sensitive as I would wish that they would be. That's just not fair to ask of them, and to really understand that it's not. It's okay to want them to be, and it's okay to be frustrated when they aren't being sensitive, but at the same time, they can only understand to a certain degree. And it took me a little bit to really get that. But I think that it did help me in the long run to understand that they're not trying to hurt you.
It just feels like it.
Yeah. At the time, it feels a little bit like, why don't you get this? But I think that it's important to understand, like, they're not attacking you. Like, it feels like it, but they're not.
No, I really appreciate you coming in, being vulnerable, and sharing. And just as we come to a close, I do want to hit you with just a final closing question of, one, what would you say to the family that is in the midst of infertility? Like, what would your words be to them? And then second, what would your words be to those on the outskirts, those friends, those family members who are with their person who is dealing with infertility?
So to the family dealing with it, I would say that at some point in the future, you will look back and it will be better. And I hated hearing that. That doesn't mean that it will be exactly as you pictured it. That doesn't mean that it will be, this perfect picturesque, like everything will just work out as it's supposed to. But at some point in the future, you will look back and say, okay, like, we've moved past this. It's not a forever season. And that was really hard for me in the moment because it feels like it. I would also say just be as open as you feel like you can with people. I wish I had been a little bit more open. I feel like I was with certain people and that ended up hurting me, but I wish I'd been more open with my family who I knew would be there for me. I think I had this perfect idea in my head of, but I want to surprise them if we're pregnant, and it ended up adding a lot of hurt and stuff onto my back. And so, be open with the people that you feel like you can be, and people that you trust to be there for you. And I think lastly, I would just kind of reiterate what I was just saying, which is give grace to the people around you, because if they're trying to be there for you, they may not know how, and be real with them about how to be there. Like, I just needed people to ask me, are you okay? What's going on now? Are you doing shots yet? Are you feeling okay? Like, I wanted people to physically be there and asking me those questions, but I didn't want to ask them to ask that.
Yeah.
And, so communicate to people what you need, because they really don't know. And then you will probably have a better support system than if you just are frustrated that they're not there. And that may just be a me issue, but I did struggle with that. And to the people around the people going through infertility, I would just say, if you know they're going through infertility, everybody's going to need something different. Some people want people there. Some people don't want anybody there. But just be as present as you can be to them, even if they don't want somebody there. Like, I'm not saying harass them, but just let them know that you're there. And if they want you to be there and want you to be more involved, then they will let you know. And if they don't, then just continue to let them know you're there. Because they still probably need your support, even if they need to isolate themselves a little bit. And I would just say be, I don't know, cognizant of what you're saying to them in order to comfort them, because I know that was some of the times that I got hurt the most, was when people thought they understood and thought they were comforting me, and it wasn't. And so just be aware of kind of what you're saying to them, and be okay, like we were talking about earlier, be okay just being there for them and not solving their fertility issue, because trust me, they've been trying. So, just be okay being there and being a friend or being a family member to them, because that's what they more than likely need, more than, another solution to a problem they've been working on. Yeah. So, that's what I would probably suggest.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. I think that that's perfect. That gives, and I really hope that gives people some insight, and not only some insight, but just that they have something that they can take with them, because even if they're not going through it now, you might interact with someone who is.
Yep. More than likely you will at some point, which is crazy. But if it's not you, then I would bet that you will know somebody at some point down the line.
Yeah. No. Well, thanks for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, appreciate you. And listeners, we will talk with you soon. Thanks. Bye.